Diversity of Life, Investigation 3.2b, more about Paramecium. Hi everyone, it's Mr. Kennard. Last video we were talking about the Paramecium and how they move, how they interact with their environment, how they're able to get around the little hair-like fingers on the outsides of them, how they bump around, how they're pretty much independent living things. This one's going to focus on a few more little things about Paramecium, specifically some of the more functions that would prove some evidence of life. Last we finished up with evidence of life. We can tell that they move. We can tell that they're interacting with their environment, responding to stimuli, responding to others, all those kinds of things. But we really haven't seen too many things about what other factors, what other key features that make them living things, part of our evidence of life checklist. That's what this lesson is going to focus on, is looking more about them and then comparing them a little bit more in detail with the Eladia cells as well. In the last lesson, we showed you a couple of videos about the Paramecium and how they were moving around, how they behaved, their twisting and spinning and bumping into each other, and just overall the whole way that their movement. And that's fairly a good way to tell if something is living or not. You can tell just by kind of looking at it. But this one, we're going to look at this database Paramecium collection to be able to look at those and find some more specific things as well, some specific actions that would help us prove that a Paramecium is actually a living thing, and I'll show those to you next. In this video, we're going to be looking at two things. They've kind of paused a Paramecium in the middle of the screen here, you can see. And what I want you to pay particularly close attention to is one of the things, well, two of the things that a living thing needs to have. It needs to have water, so it needs to be able to take water into its body, into its structure, and then also to get rid of waste. And for waste, for us, we have to exit the body. So with humans, we have our mouth and nose that allows us to breathe in and out, bringing in water, bringing in air, pushing out waste products, etc. We have other openings in our body. We're not going to go into detail about those, about how we get rid of waste in our body as well. Well, Paramecium has similar things as well. What I want you to pay particularly close attention to on this video is looking for that opening and closing of a structure in the Paramecium that might be letting water in and out, and maybe letting wastes in and out as well. Watch it again. Notice that thing in the middle closes. So that's an interesting feature within the Paramecium, is that little opening. It might be a food vacuole or a contractile vacuole that lets waste in and out, or lets food in and out, or lets water in and out of that structure. So the Paramecium with that shows us a couple more things, that it is proving to us that it is actually has evidence of life and that it is a living thing. In this illustration, this is actually a splitting Paramecium. Paramecium have a different type of reproduction in that they split in half and make an identical copy of themselves. This is a picture of a Paramecium going through that process where it's splitting into two brand new Parameciums, and the original one does not exist. So we'll show some more of those a little bit later on as well. So to review again, what characteristics were demonstrated in the videos and the images? Well, we can see that they have openings for food and water and waste products. That one is going on. And then, yeah, what's called a splitting of the Paramecium. What do you think happening? It is a form of reproduction. All living things can, or maybe do, reproduce to create a new version of that species to carry on the species. Now, this type of reproduction is what's called asexual reproduction, and that occurs within the organism itself. Mostly very small single-celled organisms will go through asexual reproduction, in that they will make a copy of everything on the inside, and then those two copies, those materials then split into two different parts, and they make two new ones from the one original, from one parent. The other form we will talk a little bit later is sexual reproduction, and that is one new offspring from two parents. We'll go into more detail about that. I've got a short video, it's about 5 minutes, that looks more in detail about the Paramecium, and specifically it shows them ways that they eat, ways that they move, ways that they interact, and then ways that they go through. It'll show several examples of this asexual reproduction that takes place. And goes into a little more detail, a little more description. And then it also talks about how these Paramecium become food for other organisms, and shows some really cool features and videos, and supplies some additional information about what takes place.
Paramecium swim happily in ponds and streams throughout the world. Their quick movements are produced by an army of hair-like oars that beat to the rhythm of intracellular chemistry. Called cilia, the tiny parts with purpose create water currents that bring a constant supply of gifts in the form of bacteria and other organic matter. Entry into Paramecium begins in the oral groove, which leads to a bustling chamber called a food vacuole. An unsuspecting bacterium might frolic for a while in this churning chamber, but its days are numbered. Correction, its minutes are numbered. For the Paramecium greets its visitors with a team of molecular adaptations that can only be described as precision instruments of death. Otherwise known as digestive proteins, they act on the residents of the food vacuole with steely determination. Chomping and munching, snipping and cutting, the Paramecium's bounty is rendered lifeless. A food vacuole turns living cells into a thick broth of non-living nutrients. Transport proteins shuttle the essential molecules across the vacuole membrane into an ocean of cytoplasm. Other teams of proteins greet the nutrients with 1,000 purposes, from energy production to building projects. The machinery within Paramecium operates at a feverish pace. Contractile vacuoles pump the Paramecium away from certain doom and explosive fate due to the invasion of water molecules. Designed by natural selection, its protein parts efficiently carry out all needed chemical reactions. Out of countless random encounters throughout the vastness of the cytoplasm, a Paramecium's life emerges into existence. But just as quickly as Paramecium transform bacteria into construction supplies, so too might Paramecium suffer the same fate, thanks to the cold pseudopods of amoeba. Perhaps they ponder the irony of digesting tiny victims while they, themselves, are being digested. More than one, followed by many, many zeros, Paramecium have ended their time on Earth as a corpse within the dynamic molecular city that is amoeba. When Paramecium's protein parts cease to function, the game of life is over. And so it is, in the incessant war that constitutes nature, that living cells attack each other, engulf, destroy, and build anew. For organisms that cannot harness the power of the sun, the price of life is the loss of life.
This is Paramecium reproducing, dividing into two cells. You can see that there. Things are being split. We call that asexual reproduction. It's dividing Paramecium that's been captured by an amoeba. So yes, living things live and then they die, sometimes by being eaten. It's a little dramatic, I would say. Very much a creative writing, storytelling. So we'll pause that right now. It's kind of cool. Anyway, those are some of the things that would help also prove evidence of life in our paramecium, being able to take in food, take in water, get rid of their wastes, move around independently, seek food, and then also splitting into two and creating a new paramecium as a result of what we know as asexual reproduction. Now let's take a minute and compare the paramecia with the Elodea leaves, not the Elodea cells, but the Elodea leaves. So what did the microscopic structure of the Elodea leaf look like? Remember, they were bricks and squares and boxes, ones that we called cells. And they made up of rows of those things. They had two different layers, a top layer and a bottom layer. And they were all brick-like structures to build that particular leaf. But compare that. What would the microscopic structure of the paramecium look like? It was kind of a long cigar-shaped sort of looking thing. Not a box, not a brick. But did it look like it was made out of cells? If all we know of a cell is a brick, then we don't know about that. But they do have similar features and things inside of them that we can compare and look at as well. Do the things inside the paramecium look like the things inside the Elodea cells? Well, they both had round structures. If you recall, the brick-like structure had those little green dots, right? Some of them were moving, etc. And then in the paramecium, kind of a shape like that, there were some other dots and stuff. But instead of green, they're probably they were different colors, some reds, some browns, some grays, all sorts of stuff. So they do have the similar shapes. They are bound within a structure, like a box or a brick or a paramecium. It's kind of a flowing cigar-shaped looking like thing, but they do have things inside them. And those same structures we see in the paramecium are actually very similar to some of these structures inside the Elodea cells. And we'll look at those in more detail. Again, here's some illustration of the Elodea and the paramecium. If we focus on those images, we can see the brick-like structures of the Elodea, much like that. We can see where they're broken into bricks and squares and boxes, versus the Elodea or the paramecium, much more of a round, oblong shape, etc. You can see the green dots inside theirs. You can see the oranges and the reds and the grays of all the different things inside the paramecium. So they may look a little different, but they do have a lot of the same features and structures inside of both of them. In looking at the Elodea and the paramecium, one big thing comes to mind. What makes up that Elodea leaf is a whole bunch of Elodea cells. You see them brick after brick, many bricks, 5 bricks across, 4 bricks across, 2 brick layers deep, thickness across. So those are what we call a multicellular organism because they have many cells. Well, a paramecium on its own is just a single-celled organism, and that is only one living cell makes up that living organism. So they are a little bit different. In fact, paramecium are really technically not made of cells because each paramecium itself is a single cell. Just like the individual green bricks in the Elodea are individual cells, each paramecium is an individual cell. Remember we said that an organism is a free, living, independent thing? The Elodea plant is an organism, and it's made of many cells, so therefore it is a multicellular organism. Paramecium is an organism also, but the paramecium, however, is just one cell, so it is a single-celled organism. Each paramecium is its own independent living thing, and the key thing about that is, can it live on its own? Each individual Elodea cell cannot live on its own. It is part of a larger organism altogether. A paramecium can live on its own as one cell. So that's a key distinction. All cells are living, but some of them are part of a bigger organism, a larger organism like a plant or some animals, whereas Paramecium are a single-celled organisms like a protist and some other ones that we'll look at as well later. So that's a big distinction between multicellular organisms and single-celled organisms. So let's revisit our focus question. How are Elodea and Paramecium alike, and how are they different? Well, many people said that the Elodea cells only stay in one place. They're kind of trapped in place like bricks in a wall, whereas Paramecia move around, freely moving around, bumping into things, twisting, turning, all that kinds of stuff. The Elodea cells, they're all stuck together, trapped in there to make up that Elodea leaf. Whereas Paramecium, they're on their own. They're individually separated, and they are independent of it. The Elodea cells are part of a bigger organism. You takes all of those Elodea cells and bricks and stuff to make the Elodea leaf, whereas the Paramecium is alone and on its own. And then Elodea cells are much smaller than the Paramecium. If you'll recall, they were about 0.1 millimeters across, where a Paramecium was about 0.3 or 0.4 millimeters across. Now that may not seem that big of a difference between, for us, you and me, but on the smaller scale, microscopic scale, those are two big different organisms. So keep that in mind as we move forward and we talk about more cells and how they might be different or alike with Elodea and Paramecium. So we could make a preliminary response to the focus question, how they move, how they're stuck together. Are they a part of a bigger organism or not? And are they smaller in terms of their sizes? Again, an organism is any living thing that is free living individual. So a Elodea cell is living, but it's not an organism. A Paramecium is living, but it is an organism because of this free living feature. So keep that in mind as we move forward and we talk about things. Are they part? Cells are alive in a multi-celled organism, but it's the entire big organism that is alive, that is living, not the individual cells on their own. If I take an Elodea cell, an Elodea cell out of the plant, it will not survive on its own. It has to be part of that bigger structure. Whereas a Paramecium, I can take it and move it someplace else and it's just fine because it is independently living. And that's the key feature we want you to keep in mind. So we've come to an important point in our investigation of life. We have been developing a definition of living by describing the characteristics of life, the functions, requirements that are common to all things that we consider living. We've identified needs like water, response to their environment, needs for food, and to eliminate their waste. Those are characteristics of life. There's many others that we've talked about as well. But again, what we see as life is also the same characteristics of cells. Cells need water. Cells respond to their environment. Cells need food. Cells eliminate their waste. But again, not all cells are organisms because not all cells are able to live independently. That's the key difference. So there are characteristics of cells. Cells are living. Life happens in cells, only in cells. They're fundamental units of life. If something needs to be living, it has to start at the cell level. So life starts at cells. So an individual cell can be living. Can it be an independent organism? A Paramecium is, but not those in the Elodea or the Elodea. So is there anything else we should add to the list of true that is all living things? We'll investigate that a little bit more in the next lesson. Thanks.